right, good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. I'm here with Richard Kim of The Nation, Democratic Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney of New York, Heather McGhee from the Demos think tank, and Josh Barro of the Manhattan Institute and Forbes. And we're in the thick of a conversation which recurs on this show because it sort of underlies everything, which is money in politics and Citizens United, and the role that billionaire casino magnate Sheldon Adelson is playing in the GOP primary election. Heather, you want to respond to what I just said? I was essentially giving the argument that Ellie Spitzer gave last week about the Citizens United essentially getting rid of a distinction without a difference between how wealthy people can exercise their influence in the political system. Absolutely.
I mean, Brandeis said you can either have a democracy in this country, you can have wealth concentrated in the hands of very few, but you can't have both. So I absolutely think that what we need to do is twofold. One, we need to get money out, and that's not just through reversing Citizens United, because it's not like we were this rich, robust, egalitarian democracy in 2009, right? So we need to get money out by both amending the Constitution around Citizens United, but also going back to say that money isn't speech. And then we need to get people in, and that's partly through public financing, so that we're encouraging small dollar donations of the kind we saw in 2008, but that still didn't really affect the vast majority of people. And we need to say that there shouldn't be as many barriers to voting. I mean, this isn't just a money problem, but it's a participation problem as well.
Congresswoman, critics of campaign finance will say, and particularly conservative critics, will say it is impossible by definition for a sitting elective legislative body to pass campaign finance that doesn't just help incumbents stay incumbents, because they all have their interests at heart. So any campaign finance system that is passed out of the United States Congress is going to be essentially an incumbent protection racket. How do you respond to that?
I disagree. Campaign finance laws that passed in city governments and in the federal government limited contributions and therefore, I would say, financial influence in politics. This decision came from the Supreme Court. Right. The Supreme Court basically said that corporations could give as much as they want, individuals could give as much as they want, and that really drummed out democracy. You saw with Sheldon Adelson, he literally bought an election in South Carolina. Governor Romney was 2 digits ahead until he came in with his $5 million. Mr. Gingrich was $1 million in debt and totally flipped that election. He could do the same thing in Florida, but I don't know what's happening there. But
can I ask you just a personal question as someone who has to raise money and stand for re-election? How does this affect your psychology? I mean, from a day-to-day level, how does this change? Do you think about what super PAC is going to swoop in and run ads against you if you vote the wrong way on something? I mean, how does it get into the head of a congressperson?
Well, money always plays a tremendous role in politics. The bill that I passed in the last Congress was, and President Obama was one of the first bills he signed into law, was the Credit Card Holders Bill of Rights. The Pew Foundation came out and said this bill alone costs industry $10 billion in 1 year by stopping abusive practices that were unfair, like raising rates anytime retroactively on your balance. And many people in the industry funded a candidate against me. So there's always this in there. I would support having no money in politics, having discussions, putting your positions out, and having shows like yours allow all the candidates to be on there and let the people make a decision.
I think that's a constitutional amendment I get behind. Every politician has to come up, and it can only speak on Up with Chris Hayes Saturday and Sunday mornings on MSNBC. Richard, you said there's something you want to say.
Well, you know, I think, and also in some ways, when you look at these candidates, it also reflects that you need money to enter politics, not just to sort of buy ads like Adelson is doing. You know, Mitt Romney is 0.006%. Newt Gingrich is a multimillionaire many times over. So that barrier has increased, and when you look down at Congress, at the Senate, the number of millionaires and multimillionaires in Congress is an all-time high.
I want to play out. Please,
I was just going to say, and that is what is so great about clean elections, fair elections, public financing that we have in Arizona, in Maine, and other states, because waitresses can become candidates for Congress. I mean, that's part of it. It's this idea that good people who serve their community in a million different ways but aren't millionaires don't at all have the ticket to even enter.
Yeah, that barrier to entry cannot be stressed enough. I mean, you have to know a lot of rich people to run for Congress, and the most likely way to know a lot of rich people is to have a lot of money.
Yet it's relatively very easy to get on the ballot. In New York State, you can just, to run for Congress, go out and get 1,500 people in your party to sign a petition that they'd like you to run, and you're on the ballot.
But the ballot's not the barrier.
Right.
The barrier is raising the money to actually campaign effectively in even a state Senate race, for example.
I want to play out the thought experiment a little bit, just in terms of the next iteration of a Sheldon Adelson, right? So let's say there's someone who says, all right, I really like this candidate for whatever reason. Nefarious motives, complete ideological affinity. Let's say it's someone on the left. Let's say there's a delightful class trader with a lot of money burning a hole in his pocket who wants to fund a liberal candidate, right? Gives him $100 million or $1 billion. I mean, there are people that can do that. Josh, what do you think would be the consequence of that? Does that trouble you at all to sort of imagine that?
Well, I think the thing is that it's much more expensive to buy unpopular policy than popular policy.
Sure.
So I think that...
But you can pay the premium.
Well, but the question is, when do you reach that point of diminishing returns, and what is the... I mean,
Yes.
I think with Sheldon Adelson, we're seeing the limits of money in politics, where, no matter how much money you throw at a candidate who's bad enough, you can't get them elected. Now, I think certainly it can matter at the margin in various instances, but I think that, the problem with this idea that you need to get money out of politics or that money isn't speech is that, first of all, it costs money to run a newspaper. There isn't this clean line between, what's money being thrown into politics and what's ordinary discourse that happens to cost money to get done. But I think that when you impose restrictions on money in politics, I think you do end up with this sort of incumbent protection racket. And the reason is that when you make it more difficult for people to get their message out by paying for it, the advantage goes to the people who have the existing presence as office holders, who have existing links with the media.
But that's just that's not been the case in Arizona and Maine. I mean, it is not the case that incumbent re-election rates went up in either of those places.
Well, I mean, Maine is a place where, what do you have, 5,000 residents in a legislative district, or 4,000? I think it's necessarily a different, less financially intensive thing than running in a congressional district with 700,000 residents.
Right. I was just going to say that, I mean, so you're conflating a couple of things. You're basically saying that that newspapers cost money to run, but the people whose views are being covered in the newspapers are not the ones paying to run it. So there's that. There's also the idea, I think you're sort of forgetting about the point that public financing is about more than just getting money out of politics. It's fundamentally leveling the playing field in a way that I think gets at your core.
Yeah, I think the idea of getting money out of politics, I don't necessarily support. I mean, in the sense that I think it's good to have a lot of money and speech
But you support a level playing field.
I do, right. So, but I think those are two distinct concepts, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is, you want people to, you want people to spend a lot of time talking about an election, and that time is going to cost money in whatever way, right? I mean, if you want to have a platform in which people have a national network, right? I mean, in some way, there's going to be resources dedicated to the proliferation of ideas throughout an electorate in a campaign. The question is the source of that money, and the way that the source of that money creates an improper dependency for the people who are going to benefit from the sources of that money.
I also think that it's not this Manchurian candidate problem. It's not that $100 million is going to buy you a candidate,
which is what I'm kind of imagining. Although I think it's also possible.
No, that's possible too. But actually, as Sheldon Adelson has shown, what $10 million buys is hegemony on the issue, so that either candidate has to stake a position that's closer to him. So it's not that they're buying candidates; it's they're buying the whole field.
Plus, there's also the iceberg element of this, which I just want to stress, which is you spend the $5 million, but there's the threat of the other 50.
Exactly.
Right. So the point is that and believe me, that gets in people's heads. That gets.
But Sheldon, we should also know, Chris, I'm sorry. Talk about Sheldon Adelson. You should also know who is buying whom.
Yeah.
And under the Citizens United decision, they do not have to even disclose who's contributing to these super PACs. We know about Sheldon Adelson because we became public, but these huge super PACs that are billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, we don't even know who's trying to influence. And at the very least, we should have access to who is making these contributions.
The journalist whose reporting cost General Stanley McChrystal his job joins us here on set right after this.